Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome an accomplished professional from Sydney, Australia, Sarah Davis. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Ash. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Sarah is a motivational speaker, an author, coach, and an adventurer. She is an author of a book titled Paddle the Nile, One Woman's Search for a Life Less Ordinary. And she has a forthcoming book, which is titled Gulp. Her overarching message is think big, act bold, do more. So, Sarah, before we talk about risk management and your books, tell me about your own amazing journey.
Oh, thanks, Ash. Well, I guess we sort of in a nutshell, professionally, it started in risk management. So for many in banking. So for many years, I was in market risk. Well, I'd started as a spot traders assistant back in the days of it was sort of Wolf of Wall Street days, where you were just a punch bag, sort of to be shouted at by the traders. And I decided that wasn't for me and got into risk management, which was suited me probably sort of mentally, what I was good at. Then got into operational risk and project management within risk. But I kind of always had this feeling, while it was sort of a strength, it just wasn't quite, that this wasn't quite it, that it wasn't really me. And I did have a few years out as a personal trainer, and then got back into banking and found myself at Macquarie. And it was by far and away like the best organization I'd worked at. But I'd sort of describe it as it was a little bit like having a really beautiful piece of clothing, but it just didn't quite suit me. So I was still searching for what this thing was. Anyway, long story short, I decided that I was going to go on a very big expedition to paddle the length of the Nile in Africa, from its source in Rwanda to Egypt. It took 2 years to organize it. I spent then 6 months on this expedition. It wasn't always on the go, because it was all self-organized and just with local teams. So it would be do a section, stop, organize what I needed for the next section. Like I say, it began in Rwanda, finished in Egypt. We did about 1,100 Ks of rafting, 3,000 of kayaking. And it was what I was looking for. It made me come alive, like really made me come alive. And it felt like I'd found what I was looking for. But obviously it's not something that readily makes money. It definitely costs a lot of money. So I returned to corporate and some contracting, and then went on some more adventures. So cycled across Australia, did a solo descent of the Murray River here in Oz. And more recently, at the beginning of this year, just spent a month solo bikepacking around Oman. So yeah, and then in the background, I've been developing my practice, speaking, writing, coaching, fundamentally on how we can embrace risk and live and lead boldly.
Fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about risk management for leaders and startups, which is an area that you know a lot about. How do you define risk-taking in a leadership context? And how do you assess whether a risk is worth taking?
Well, I mean, you can come back to the ISO definition, which would say that risk is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So, you've got a goal and there's no guarantees without a way of seeing into the future of exactly how that's going to work out. And look, I think fundamentally it comes back to decision making. Every decision you make, there is going to be, generally there's a level of uncertainty with that. You can't guarantee what the outcome's going to be. As a leader, it could be even living with previous decisions. You inherit a team, you inherit decisions that have previously been made. So those decisions as a leader, they're either going to be strategic, existing ones that you're inheriting, or it's a response to the changes that are going on around you, changes in the market, changes in technology. Of course, the conversation that we're having so often is around the impact of AI.
Absolutely.
You know, so it creates risk, but it creates opportunity, you know, and this is the thing, too often we associate risk with the unwanted outcomes.
Correct.
But for anyone, like whether it's in business or in our personal life, without risk, there's no growth. And that's the upside. And that's why we take risk. And this is why I encourage people to embrace it, but to be doing it in a managed way. You know, we want to be smart and not be reckless.
Well said. Well said. And yet, you know, when it comes to risk, as you said, you know, sometimes risk is associated generally with something that could go wrong. What are, in your view, are some common misconceptions about risk taking?
Well, this, you know, that risk is bad, that it's something that we should avoid. I think too often now we see, well, certainly here in Australia, you know, increasingly this nanny state, how we should avoid risk. And if we're not looking at it as something that we practice, we don't get good at, you know, being decision makers and learning how to assess risk. I think people look at it as something that it can't be quantified, but obviously, you know, it absolutely can be quantified, and there are, you know, many situations when it should be. Or that people might think that risk, it just has to be accepted as is, you know, that there's nothing we can do, we can't dial it down. And I think that's a huge mistake. There is so much we can do to actually remove unwanted risks, or people just turn around and just have this thing of like, oh, well, I'm not a risk taker, that's not who I am. And I think that's absolutely what we all are, because even if you're not taking risk, you are actually taking risk.
And my next question for you, Sarah, is what strategies would you recommend for leaders to cultivate a risk-taking mindset within their teams? Because generally, you know, people, I've heard this many times from people, we welcome mistakes, but make sure you don't repeat the mistake, and so on and so forth. I'd love your perspective.
I think it's true. People say, you know, you can make a mistake, but sort of don't repeat it. I mean, that can be okay so long as it's done in a positive way. But you can say, oh, yeah, it's okay to take mistakes, but then you still get, you know, you see people getting sort of into trouble or it not being treated well when mistakes are made. Like, you have to have that acceptance that failure is okay, and there aren't going to be consequences, or you put, you know, this is how far we can go with this. You know, it's like, if you go, it's a loss of this much, or, you know, quantify how far someone can go within these boundaries. This is acceptable. You've got to have some trust there. I think you need to have a general willingness to be challenged. If you're taking a risk, like you're making those decisions, to accept people going, okay, well, does that make sense? To having a dialogue and a discussion about it, that's seen as a positive thing, because, you know, when you're assessing risk and deciding, is it worth taking, you know, having a good structured approach, I think, you know, looking like, well, what are we trying to achieve here? What are the options that we could look at to get there? What could potentially go wrong? Like, you know, having a nice structure about it, and then looking at, okay, well, how could we avoid that happening? How do we manage that? How do we mitigate it? How do we have a response plan? Having people around a table, you know, potentially doing that red hat, okay, like, challenge me on this. Like, I think this would work. What do you think? What am I missing? You know, having that open dialogue about things, for leaders to be focused on, and for the goal to be doing the right thing, and it's not about being right, it's about doing the right thing. And to have that approach as a team to go, how can we do the right thing, and how can we try and avoid things going wrong? But we've got to be able to have that space and that wiggle room to accept it if things don't go wrong, and if they do, to pull out those lessons from it.
Well said. And what role, in your view, does intuition play in the decision-making process, especially when it comes to risks?
I mean, so much of it's going to depend on the situation. When we're having to make quick decisions, I think then a lot of the time it's going to be coming much more by our intuition, which is, you know, based on our previous experience. I think sometimes we can use it to, to bolster our confidence in the decisions that we're making. Yeah, I think it really does depend on the situation
Mm.
as to where it's appropriate to allow our intuition to come in. But I think we do need to hold a space for it and to allow ourselves to check in with, that knowing. What is our knowing telling us?
Mhm.
And to explore that. But yeah, you've got to balance that with what the objective is, what the risks are on the table,
Mm.
who's involved. Like I
Yeah,
think it's very situational
well
dependent,
said.
but
Great,
certainly shouldn't be ignored.
great response. Thank you. So my next two questions are for startups because a lot of our viewers and listeners are young and entrepreneurial. How can startups use risk taking as a competitive advantage?
I mean, startups are in the business of taking risks, so I think they're already there. I think the advantage comes in how they manage it. So it's they're in a space where they can be a lot more agile. Like, I've worked in the banks, and someone wants to, a trader wants to go and take go into a new product or a new market. They've got to jump through hoops of fire to get all the approvals. The advantage that a startup has is that they can be very nimble, generally,
Mm.
certainly in the early days, and make those changes and take those risks.
Mm.
I think it's being careful to make sure you're doing the work up front to look at some scenarios as to how could this play out? What are the consequences of doing this? How likely is this?
Mm.
And there's all sorts of things, you can play as startups will be doing using a minimum viable product and testing different things. It's investing a bit of time, I think, in looking at those decisions and looking what the consequences could be, and just making sure that you're not taking unwanted and avoidable risks.
Mm.
So from a legal perspective, making sure you're not going to be breaking any regulations, or that you've got the required licenses. Like,
Mm.
avoid those. And you see startups, unfortunately, coming undone because of really avoidable things.
Mm.
It's knowing your numbers, it's knowing your
Yeah.
finances, it's monitoring how you're progressing. What's the North Star? How are you progressing towards that? Those
Mm.
key metrics, and keeping an eye on those.
Mm.
So I think they can absolutely, in a place to be able to take risks, but it's doing it in a smart way and making sure that they are responding and not reacting, I think, is important.
Mm. Well said. So one more question relating to risk, and then I want to move to your books. Can you give me some examples of small calculated risks that can lead to significant benefits for startups?
I mean, the obvious one, that I think every startup would have heard of would be your minimum viable product, getting
Mm.
something out to the market that you
Yeah.
can test.
Mm.
Then it could be experimenting with different marketing channels, whether it's ads or social media or partnerships. Beta testing with target customers, select groups of customers, and having really strong feedback loops to be
Mm.
able to, and having an agile development process that you can
Right.
quickly incorporate that feedback into it to deal with problems that come up. Hiring contractors before hiring permanents, outsourcing where you can to leverage finances, testing pricing strategies. Do you offer a free limited functionality version, or do you offer a free trial with full functionality? What resonates better? There's lots of different levers, I think, that startups can use to their benefit.
Mm. Well said. Let's move to your two books. Your first one is Paddle the Nile, One Woman's Search for a Life Less Ordinary. And in the beginning of our conversation, you tell us a little bit about how you, I think, kayaked for 3,000 kilometers. Uh, but tell me about a little more about this book, and what was your inspiration to share your adventure, and what were some of your learnings if you relate it to risk taking?
Yeah, I mean, so the book, it's the memoir of that, of that expedition. Yeah, for me, it was really valuable to write the book from a very selfish perspective
Mhm.
of really reflecting and processing and unpacking it all. I think it can be very tempting when we do something, whether it's business or in our personal lives, is to go, oh, yeah, done. Okay, on to the next thing. But what we don't do is that, like they say in the military, the after action review, or in projects, a post implementation review, to draw out the kind of, what was the plan? How did it actually turn out? What worked well, and what could I do differently? And so for me, writing the book was really powerful from that perspective. But when it came to the actual expedition, applying exactly what I do in corporate to this project, and doing going through and doing a complete a risk assessment on it, it brought benefits that I really wasn't expecting. Like, for one, it created boundaries of what I was getting into. This was
Mhm.
all incredibly unfamiliar territory.
Mhm.
So by understanding all of these things that could go wrong and assessing it, I knew what I was getting into. It helped me unpack fears. It helped me come up with mitigation plans. It helped me dial down the risk, and really helped set me up for success. And this is what, managing risk is all about. It's all
Mhm.
about setting up for success. So then when things happen, for example, when I'd done the assessment, I realized that getting um arrested, even if I hadn't necessarily done the wrong thing, was quite likely. And I don't know how to respond to that
Mhm.
situation.
Mhm.
So I'd engaged a company. So I had someone who I checked in with on a daily basis. So they were back here in Australia.
Mhm.
And one of the things they would do is give me a very detailed intel report. I would tell them the plans of the day, but they were also there to help should any crises come up.
Mhm.
So we at one point we were on this lake where the river that we'd come down sort of just clipped the top of this lake and then was continuing on. And anyway, we were asking for directions because there were multiple channels that weren't on my GPS, and some local guys came and helped us, and actually they took us over the border, because this was on the edge of a lake, this unmarked border,
Mhm.
into Burundi,
Mhm.
and then dobbed us into the army. And so then we were, long story short, placed under, well, told to row across the lake, and we were questioned and then effectively placed under house arrest.
Wow.
So as we were going across the lake, I'm just messaging my this person, Dave, to sort of go, this is what's happening. And then he's then going and talking to the people that he needed to talk to help get us released from that. So it
Mhm.
just brought home the power of risk management,
Mhm.
and how it's so applicable to whatever we're doing.
How interesting. How interesting. And how has the process of writing and reflecting on your experiences changed your own approach to future risks and your adventures?
Um, I mean, the writing, I think it's more that it's in the doing.
Hmm.
It's when we go and take those risks. And I guess, part in doing the reflection is you work at, like I said, what's worked, what hasn't. But when you do these things, your world becomes a bigger place. And certainly that was the case for me coming off the back of the Nile trip. It's given me a lot of confidence to go and do things that would have previously seemed, out of my comfort zone, now sort of fall in my comfort zone, and to learn to trust in my ability to deal with what comes up,
Hmm.
in that kind of everything's figure outable. And I think the more we are taking risk and dealing with challenges and obstacles, the better
Mhm.
we become at problem solving,
Mhm.
and the more we build our confidence and our trust in our ability to solve them, and different approaches and frameworks and tools, and we just keep adding on to that toolkit. So I think it's it's a doing, it's a real doing thing, and
Mhm.
experimenting and trying different things,
Mhm.
but absolutely the importance of reflecting on what's been done and what's been achieved.
Well said. Well said. So I have time for two more questions for you, Sarah. My next question is, can you discuss or talk about a lesson from your adventures that you wish more leaders in the business world would learn from?
There's probably a couple. I mean, I've shared some already. In one, in the value of doing the risk management. But
Hmm.
another big part comes down, it's your team. It's having the right resources and empowering them to do what they do best. So on the Nile trip for the section where we were rafting, I engaged 3 Ugandan rafting guides. So they're very experienced in whitewater rafting and whitewater kayaking. So when we were on the river, I wasn't the leader at that point.
Hmm.
That was over to Paolo, who was our lead rafting guide,
Hmm.
because he has the one with the most experience. And of course I wasn't, it's like I wanted to make sure I was the weakest link there.
Hmm.
Then when we were off the river, then I pick up the leadership mantle when I'm doing, getting the food, getting
Hmm.
the camp set up and all of those things. And so I think when you are taking that risk, it's having that really strong team around you who will have the experience and the skills that you don't necessarily have,
Hmm.
and being comfortable with that and being willing to hand over the reins to them when the time is appropriate.
Hmm.
I think it can be difficult in that startup space in particular, where it's your baby, and you're very attached to that, to hand over that mantle at times, but you cannot be everything that business needs.
Hmm. Very
It's
well
not
said.
possible. And to know your strengths and your weaknesses and being okay with that, and to know what your biases are, and having people who will counter that, and and counter those, those areas that aren't your strength.
Correct. Correct. And I'm taking one more lesson from what you're telling me, which is to trust the people you're working with.
Yeah, you've
Hmm.
got to trust them, and that they can then do their best. If they feel you trust them, they are going to step up to that. Like, we've all been in that experience where we feel someone trusts us to do what we do best,
Hmm.
and you step up to that. If you feel that someone's always second guessing you and doubting you and questioning everything
Hmm.
you do,
Hmm.
it's very hard to want to give your best.
Well said. Well said. And my last question to your book is about your forthcoming book,
Yeah.
Gulp. Tell me a little bit about it and when do you expect to release it?
So Gulp is going to be how to embrace risk and live boldly. And I've written this, or I'm writing this. It's still in process. Because I want to be able to give people the tools of how to, not just to embrace risk, but how to unpack it,
Hmm.
how to take action in spite of fears and self-doubts, with the strategies to overcome those fears and self-doubts that can so often hold us back. It's easy to play safe and to get stuck in our comfort zones, but the thing is, life, it can end up getting a little bit beige. And I'm all about trying to bring more color into our lives,
Hmm.
and whether that's personally or professionally. So it also comes with a bit of a sales pitch as to why we should be taking more risk.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, it's really taking everything I've learned from my professional career and my adventures to help people have those gold moments, to go looking for them, and
Hmm.
to step towards them.
Amazing. Amazing. And on that note, Sarah, thank you so much for speaking to me about your own incredible journey down the Nile. I think when I was reading about you, I was so fascinated that you could actually draw upon lessons from an adventure into something that you have been doing or are specializing in, which is management of risk, and then give lessons for leaders and for startups. Thank you for talking to me about so many different aspects of risk management. Thank you also for speaking to me about your first book, Paddle the Nile, as well as your forthcoming book, Gulp. When you're ready with your second book, Gulp, let me know and we'll schedule another conversation with you. Thank you again for
Thanks.
speaking with me and good luck.
Thanks so much, Ash. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast. For platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.